So we're supposed to be talking about the changing face of economic education. And yesterday when I came in from the airport, even though my department is paying for it, I decided to do an Uber share because it's always more fun to talk to somebody. And my ride share was a young woman from Charlotte, and when she found out what I was doing, she's like, "Oh, I bet economic education has changed a lot since you first started." Well, yes, I have been at it for a while, and yes, that's the topic that I'm going to discuss tomorrow. So, yes.
That's funny. I actually don't do Ubers because I don't like to talk to other people.
Oh, you don't? Well, thank you for agreeing to talk to us today. I appreciate it. I'm going to start with Steve by asking you, how have your students changed over the years?
Well, that's interesting because I'm not really sure that they have. I understand that they're more tech savvy than me. They understand how to use whiteboards and they play these great video games on their computers and so forth. So they've got a different set of skill sets. And it's hard to analyze because I switched schools, and my schools, the critical SAT scores are improving. But frankly, we live in an era where technology is changing at a pace in the last quarter century like never before. The next 25 years are going to be even more amazing. But I'm wondering if internally, if the students have really changed that much. I very much view myself as sort of an accidental learner. I did not get challenging questions like the last presenter had, and I sort of memorized test banks and sort of learned economics that route. They're tech savvy, no doubt about it, but I view them very much as my generation and as some of my students 20 years ago as very much still passive learners. Yes, there are students that go out there and try to actively seek out all the knowledge they can and try to get at all the knowledge they can. But I'm not sure that the tools that we're discussing, and I think it's going to depend largely on how those tools are designed, are so enthralling that they're not going to quickly switch over to Bejeweled or Candy Crush or something. And so how have the students changed? It's very difficult to say. Their skill sets have changed, but their willingness to seek out knowledge and understand things and not ask for the answers, like the last guest speaker said, I think that's sort of been constant for my years of teaching.
Constant. Jose, what about for your students?
So, I mean, I agree. I mean, the students themselves haven't changed so much. The last time I checked, they're still human, right? So right. So, and I think it's really how their preferences have changed, and I think their preferences outside the classroom, I don't think have changed a lot, and research kind of say that it's just changed marginally, right? But in general, they care about the same things. I mean, examples that use cocaine, beer, and pizza are still more interesting than ice cream cones. I mean, that's just how it is. But what I think have changed is, like, I think if an instructor have told the students in a class 40 years ago that the class was canceled, I think they would have been less happy 40 years ago than how happy they are today. So I do think that that's kind of how they changed, is that I think for some reason they have become more focused on their grades. And I think that's actually a function of our teaching. I think that's actually our fault and not their fault. And I think the reason why we have been shifting more to grades is, like, in general, I think teaching have shifted more from content and design to more motivating students. And since that's the only way that we have traditionally motivated them is with grades, then we are using them more, I think, to motivate them. And also they have the labor market all of a sudden have put more stress on the signal. I mean, this is what Alex, you talk about. And now they care only about the signal, right? They don't really care so much about anything else. And the problem is that using grades as motivation is quite pervasive. I mean, we have this idea that if we don't give students grades, they won't do it. And there's actually very little research to support that people are more motivated by using external rewards than internal rewards. So, the part of what I'm going to try to say, as you're going to get tired of hearing me on saying this in the panelists, is I would like a shift on focus from external grades or using grades to motivate rather than using other things.
So I'm going to I'm going to disagree with my colleagues a little bit and say that I have seen changes. I would say there's more female students, there's more international or foreign-born students, and of all types of students, they're more easily distracted than ever before. I think we have to adjust on all three of these margins. With more female students, I think it's important to, it doesn't take a lot of work, but just to mix our pronouns and our professions and things like that. I think we're way beyond the years when but the surgeon was his mother. We shouldn't be surprised anymore, right? So we need to mix things up a little bit. International examples, I think, are very important, not just for international students, but we all live in a globalized world. So in writing a textbook, this is, I think, very important to have global examples. We talk about the monsoons in India as a way of introducing something like real business cycles, very intuitive approach. And then on the big issue of distraction, I teach a night class quite often at George Mason. And that night, I never get to sleep. I have insomnia all night because I have to jack myself up. I got to take the caffeine. I have to entertain a lot more than I think I did before because the students they're used to entertainment on demand, and they're used to if something gets boring, then they just click off. They click away, and they do that when they're in classroom as well. So I think all of us have to, work a lot harder to kind of edutainment, right? To kind of entertainment and education, to kind of blend these things together. It's made lecturing more difficult. It means that active learning is much more important, right? You got to bring the students into the conversation. That is much more important. If I can't entertain them all the time, then I've got to get the students to entertain each other a little bit, right? At least to interact a little bit. It's easier to do that, if you have a 3-hour class or an hour-and-a-half class, rather than just lecturing. It's easier to introduce some active learning into the classroom, which keeps the students involved. It's also a better method of teaching. And then technology, which I think we'll get to even more. But I use quite a bit of video, flipping the classroom, producing the videos at MR University, things like that. Where we can use the animation, the sound, the color, and things of this nature to keep students' attention, because that's the medium that they're now most familiar with.
Right. Is that their expectation? Do they have different expectations about what you bring to the classroom when you show up?
Yeah, I mean, is this for Alex?
Jose.
Why you want to
Okay. I'll
take it first.
I think so. The students, they think education, that's like a TED Talk, right? And so, I gave a TED Talk once. That was like my best 15 minutes of teaching ever in my life. I'm not that good, in my regular 15 minutes of teaching, okay? But that's what they're expecting. And I think the standards have gone up because students have a much broader choices of where to get entertainment and where to get education as well. I mean, there's some fantastic technologies on YouTube and fantastic teachers on YouTube and TED Talks and things like that. And so I think we're all challenged by that.
Do you bring more things to the students before class than you used to, for instance, Steve?
Yes and no. I'm still pretty much a sage on the stage type of professor, and I try to entertain the students as wildly as I can, and as Alex said. But there are certain visuals and videos and supplements and Zimbabwe billion-dollar currency marks and so forth that you can share with the students that sort of gets them to think a little bit and gets sort of the ball rolling. Because I believe it's absolutely right that they are distracted quite easily, and sometimes they're laughing. I don't tell jokes in class, so I'm pretty sure there's something else that's going on behind the scenes there. Just saying.
But I still think, I thought I didn't know I was going to start disagreeing with you so quickly. So I actually don't think, attention spans, when you look at, with the research, attention spans are just still about 5 to 6 minutes, of listening to a continuing talk. If you go beyond those, 30 years or 50 minutes, this is just a human, it's a human biological, pattern. It's not really that affected, in my opinion, by culture, and I think there are some changes at the margin, but I don't think they're that great. And in the issue of technology, for instance, I think the reason why more people are flipping the classroom today versus before is not because of students' demand, it's simply because the technology is cheaper. It's just cheaper to do it now than it was prohibitively expensive to do it before. So I think that it's not, I don't think it's a function of what the students are kind of demanding, for the most part.
So do you think that maybe the students in the past were just as bored after 5 minutes, they just didn't have the way to signal it, now they pull out their cell phone?
That's what I believe, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see. I'm going to start the second question with Alex. I'm going to move this around. How's your course coverage changed since you began teaching? I'm thinking in terms of, are there topics that you think that are more important to get across to students these days, and things that you might have dropped or thought, well, let me approach it a different way and move it to a different part of the semester?
Let me begin with what I think is a sort of a common myth that we hear a lot. The idea that economists missed the financial crisis, therefore there has to be a complete change, revolution in what we teach. I think that's a total myth. I think that's completely incorrect. And here I agree with Paul Krugman. So it doesn't happen that often, but I think Paul is absolutely correct when he says, look, the financial crisis in essence was a bank run. Now, what we didn't understand was how large the shadow banking system was. And I mean, that's absolutely correct. I remember at the time as this crisis was occurring, I was looking at the statistics, from the Federal Reserve, and credit, was continuing to going up. There was no big decline. And I said, how can people be talking about a credit crunch when the data shows nothing is happening to credit? It's been continuing to go up. And meanwhile, the newspapers are all saying there's a huge credit crunch. Well, it turned out that the Federal Reserve just didn't know. The data was not there. The Federal Reserve didn't know that the shadow banking system was at least as large, as important as the regular banking system. So once we picked up on that, however, then I think the analysis of the financial crisis, banking run, aggregate demand shortfall came through fairly clearly. So I think on those kinds of questions, we need to update things like the size of the financial markets are more important than we thought. We need to talk about the new ways in which the Federal Reserve, operates. It's under completely new directions, guidelines now. It's not open market operations quite the way it used to be before. So I think on those kinds of practical issues, the facts, then we need to update and change. On the fundamentals, however, I think we're pretty good, actually, in principles. I say that the textbook, Modern Principles, I call it a supply and demand textbook, right? So we really want to teach supply and demand. We want to teach that well. We want to teach a few things really well rather than many things, broadly. Supply and demand was what they were teaching 100 years ago. Supply and demand will continue to be taught 100 years from now, no matter what technological innovations or new theories we come up with. Supply and demand is really kind of the heart of the discipline. So on those things, on the principles, I think we're actually not too bad.
Do you think you teach the same that you taught when you started, Steve?
Well, I would say that another way that it has changed is in terms of the Keynesian cross model has sort of shifted out of favor. They went with the Mankiw book, 25 years ago, went to an aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And Alex's book shifted to one that's even more realistic with the dynamic aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So yeah, it has shifted. And in some ways, ironically, the Keynesian cross model has begrudgingly more applications today that were at zero interest rates. And there's no question, at least in my mind, that the next recession, if we ever have one, is we're going back to zero, right? Whatever the rate is, it's going back to zero. And we'll have another liquidity trap. And under those circumstances, fiscal policy makes a little bit more sense, like I said, begrudgingly. But so we see that shift. We see things like the Keynesian, the kink demand curve. I mean, I started writing a book with Scott Sumner, Economics of Business Perspective. And we pulled up this not the Keynesian cross, back on the kink demand curve. And there would literally be books that would say, here's the kink demand curve, it's wonderful. And then like there's a whole paragraph on why it's wrong in the same book, you know. So I see some books slowly shifting away from that. Our book has a little bit more emphasis on supply and demand in terms of let's try to understand what happened. A lot of people say, well, if this happens, what's going to happen to price and quantity? And you sort of make predictions. But we sort of have a little bit of never reason from a price change sort of attributes where we're trying to say, okay, this happened, what curve shifted and why, and try to sort of work backwards. And that seems to have a tremendous impact. That came from my co-author. And so there's little tweaks going around the edges here that have occurred over the years. But yeah, the basics of what Alex said about the supply and demand model being the cornerstone of economics, that's absolutely true. So I would.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I sometimes, my students tell me, oh, do I have to buy this book or this edition? And I tend to tell them, you can use any book, just make sure it's within 100 years old and you'll be okay. But I think the one point is like, in terms of coverage, I do cover less. And I have shifted from focus on quantity to quality. And I think that's, again, it's a natural shift because as instructors, we are shifting from content to more motivation and kind of, and one of those parts is active learning. I mean, a good example of that is like, if you want to do more active learning in class, you're going to figure out that you're not going to be able to cover all the chapters you were covering before, so you're going to have to start cutting. So, I mean, it's a natural progression for anyone who's trying to bring kind of active learning, either from a learning reason or from a motivational reason. And I think that pattern will continue. So I will see, my prediction is like, in 5 or 10 years, books could be the same size, but we will be an average covering a lot less of the textbook.
What have you dropped from your coverage in order to do more active learning?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, like Alex said, I will drop anything that doesn't have to do with supply and demand. So I will just focus on that model a lot, right? So I don't even do externalities anymore. I definitely don't do indifference curves. So I mean, I extended so if you introduce supply and demand kind of in the second week, so that actually lasts a lot longer now because I think students take a long time to figure out what's the change in quantity versus a change in the curve. So I think it takes them, I don't know, I think the quickest you can do that is in 3 weeks. So basically, I just kind of go slower and don't bring applications to the supply and demand like taxes or elasticity until I'm confident that most students understand that basic difference. And I think, I can do it in a week, right? So.
Are you teaching mostly microeconomics?
Yes.
Jose?
I've taught macro, but my major course is micro.
Is micro. And Steve?
Yeah, same. I teach mostly micro, but
Mostly
I do
micro.
teach macro.
Okay. I was just wondering whether there would be a difference in macroeconomics if there were topics that you would leave on the cutting floor. Alex?
Yeah, it's more a case of just macroeconomics changes because the economy at that level changes more. The institutions change more, right? So it's not a matter, I think, of cutting some things. It's just some things are just not relevant any longer. And so you can't, it's no point doing them.
Well, I kind of think that maybe we've covered what has stayed the same in terms of asking what changed, because you would say mostly things have stayed the same.
Well, I would say there's one thing that we haven't discussed, and that was touched on a little bit by Alex, but we do have an increasing number of international students. And I think AACSB regulations, because I went to business school, they really want to make sure economists focus on things like exchange rates and currency changes and in ways that haven't been done before. We do focus, many books have shifted over the years to have a greater focus on gains from trade and things of those natures. So that's one topic that I think, at least in my understanding, I wonder what the panelists would say, has gained in terms of traction and importance over the last few decades. But a lot of other things, like you said, the externalities and indifference curves and so forth and so on, that has shrunk. And in some ways, at least the book we're writing, the currency models, and I've seen it in other books, it's just an application of the supply and demand model applied to currency, and it just reinforces a lot of things and understandings of the world. And the gains from trade model is more of one of producer and consumer surplus, which is another extension of supply and demand. But I think that's one area that has increased in importance in the last few decades.
I think students are certainly more aware of international trade and the importance of that in the U.S. economy. I mean, it's hard to listen to the president and not hear the importance of international trade, positive or negative.
But even before that, yeah.
So we have some work to do on that issue. Thank you for creating jobs for us, President Trump, so that we can teach the gains from trade. Made us more relevant than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, in the issue of international students, I agree. I mean, there's definitely getting a larger percentage. And I mean, I do think it has some impact on content. I mean, in my own teaching, I don't know exactly how it has been. I don't know if it transferred to, well, if there are more international students, I have to talk more about international things. No. I think it also has to do a little bit with the, perhaps the way in which we teach. And I think culturally, the challenge I've been facing with teaching international students is more with the way in which I teach cultural things that are different between different countries and kind of the model to the U.S. So, I mean, I'm sure there's a content change. I don't know exactly what's the proportion.
It's really interesting to me that you said teaching the cultural differences, because I think that students are coming in with more of a resistance to the idea of capitalism. They've heard so much about crony capitalism, and they see the downside of it. That's one thing that I see with my students, is more of a hesitancy to think that what we're teaching is important. Do you see that? How do you address that?
I mean, I don't know about that particular one. I have to think about it, but like two quick ones that I just thought about. So I think the issue of cheating is different in different countries. So that has, I have to kind of adjust some of those issues in my class. As my class has become more international, that issue has kind of changed kind of a little bit. The issue of how valuable are grades in different cultures is also different, I think. So I think the fact that I have more students internationally, and they have a different kind of view of what a grade is or how important they are, that have kind of changed the way grades are actually viewed in my class as a motivator for performance or anything like that. So I think the changes at least in my view, they have impacted me more on those levels than actually the content itself.
Yeah, so I think, go ahead.
Steve.
Okay. I do think the shift international maybe shouldn't be paired with the fact that there's more international students. I think that was coming regardless of who the president was. I think they just are well aware of the international competition and globalization in a way that never have been before. Certainly not when I was a student 10 years earlier. But you also do have to be careful about the cultural differences. References and jokes about the Super Bowl mean very little to my Saudi students.
That's the reason they don't laugh at your jokes anymore.
Yeah, it's not because of my age.
Trying to help you.
Yeah.
I find that students are much more cynical than they used to be. It's another change. This doesn't impact actually my principles class, but I also teach public choice or political economy. And so it used to be that my job was to teach people to be a little bit cynical about the politicians. Politicians are self-interested. This is sort of they're just people like you and I. They don't change. They're not just benevolent. And now I don't have to do any of that at all. In fact, if anything, I have to push back a little bit because they're so cynical that they just think politics can't work at all, and so you kind of have to push back on that a little bit.
Wow.
Well, let me ask a little bit more about the technology that you actually use in your classroom when you're actually in front of the students. Maybe Alex first.
So I do, I produce a lot of videos for MR University, And I do think that is the way that the technology is going, that the market, the educational market is going. For one, as the points already mentioned earlier, is that you could make it very informative and fun, and you can add the music and the animations and so forth. And this is the type of quality students are used to. The other thing is, when you're using video, this scales to a much greater extent. So you can teach 100,000 students as easily as you can teach 100 students. What I think is most interesting is going to be the technology behind that. So the way that artificial intelligence systems are going to be used to grade students and also to direct students to just those pieces of the educational puzzle that they need to be filled in. So what I mean by that is when you have experience, an experienced teacher begins to see in the errors which the student is making, they begin to see the pattern, and then they realize, okay, this student doesn't understand, this concept, and you can kind of help them with that concept. Well, when you have hundreds of thousands of students, the AI systems are going to be able to pick that up among students individually and direct those students, okay, you've made these errors, you need to watch this video, or you need to do this. I think we're also going to see with randomized controlled trials. You can do randomized controlled trials much, much easier in the online world than you ever could in the physical world. We can very easily try out two different ways of teaching a concept, randomly give the students one approach. Half the students one approach, half the students the other approach. 3 months later, you see how they did on the exam. So I think we're going to see much more improvement in how we teach, in the methods of teaching. We're going to see much more improvement in the next 20 years than we've seen in the previous 200.
Do you actually show the videos during your class?
Sometimes. So
Sometimes you
I
do.
do some flipping and have the video, have them watch beforehand. Other times I'll use that at the beginning of a class. And then, see, if you just have the video alone, it's very much like we had from Professor Dunning, is you watch the video and it's so smooth, it's so clear that the students think they understand it, right? Because they watch it, they enjoyed it. Oh, I enjoyed it, therefore I understood it. Right. Okay? And that's not true. So you can start off the video and then you ask them questions. Okay? The video gets their motivation, gets their interested. Okay? And then you ask them questions and you slow down and, okay, well, when is this point wrong? Or what are the assumptions under which this point was made, right? And so you can go through on each individual part and go into more depth. So that's part of the active learning.
Okay. So I'm wondering what's the difference between actually having them watch a video or do an exercise in class versus flipping the classroom and having them do it ahead of time. How do you actually, Jose, you're the expert here, I think. How do you get them to do what they're supposed to do before they show up for class?
Well, you kind of shifted gears there with that. I thought you were going in one direction, and I was ready to answer that question. I think
You can grade it, right?
Well, that's the thing, one of the things you can do is you can offer them, grade to do it, right? But the truth, even if you offer them grade, what you can potentially do is to incentivize cheating, right? So the question is, how do you get them to do it? You kind of find out what attention spans, how much in general you can get away with, and I figure out it's about 18 to 22 minutes, and I just make sure that I don't go over that time. So that's kind of my approach is. I think the main is make sure the videos are follow what we know about attention, make them short, make them interesting, cut them in chunks so you can fix them around, and just nudge students. And if they don't do it, get good data about how many of them are completed them, and then kind of have a good process to contact those students who are kind of falling behind.
Steve, you look like you have something you want to say.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, actually. Big surprise for those that know me. But I do think the videos have some benefits and have some cost in that the videos, I used to always think of when I teach, it's like, a stage performer on Broadway does a 975th show of Cats, and You know, Professor Rubb's 975th presentation of elasticity, a measure of responsiveness. It's a big hit with students. They really get it, and they keep paying to come back every year, or at least pay me to keep performing. But I'm not sure how you truly flip it and get them to be what I sort of started with, the active learners to passive learners. What I loved about the online tools is, and I think you were at University of Texas, Austin, or El Paso. The University of Texas, El Paso has this program they call Circles, and they let the students learn the content and keep taking the content until they pass the content and keep going, right? Rather than some sort of fixed, 12-week schedule, and you're going to get a fixed scale based on how your other classmates do, but that's not really what we want. At least for a principal's level course, we want them to master the content. Even more so for my MBA, and I teach an MBA Intro to Econ class, and I teach MSFIN and M class, same basic class. We want them to get the basic content down. So I've been designing some things where I let them take these practice tests until they're at nausea. But sometimes I have students that have literally been econ majors, and they love the class because A, they're done really quickly, but B, they sort of get to relearn it after having had the higher level classes and some business experience, what they learned as an undergraduate. And those are some students that really are just, wow, I didn't quite get all this before, but now they're really into it. But for the other students that have never had it, and sometimes you get a weird mix. You get the engineer student who studied engineering physics at Cornell or wherever and just never had an econ class for whatever reason, and they're very gifted students, but they never had econ, and they go through it pretty quickly. But then you've had the other students, particularly in these MBA classes, for the foundational courses, and giving them time to learn it properly, in my estimation, is one of the biggest and best attributes of the online technologies. You don't have to rush them through it. You have to keep them on pace, though. When I teach online, keeping them on pace seems to be the toughest thing. As I've aged, I've become increasingly, I've been teaching online for a while, not 100,000 students, but I think the hybrid model really hits that sweet spot where you have a lot online, maybe fewer sections or smaller sections where you can interact with them more often. The downside of the hybrid model is that it puts you right back into that rich timeline schedule, but there's a lot of possibilities out there, and I think part of the wonderful part about this conference that Macmillan's putting on is that it's sort of we're trying to figure out how all these is going to come together, because we kind of sort of know it's going to change. We're not quite sure how it's going to change. We're skeptical about some things, and other things we're a little more positive about. But it's quite a fascinating time we live in.
But I do think that the one thing that I think is going to change is that the lecture is going to eventually. I mean, the lecture in the classroom eventually is going to end. And I think it's not because the value of the lecture in classroom is not high. I think it's just the opportunity cost is actually too great now of what you could do in the classroom instead. And the classroom is the only time that you have all the students in the same place with you. So that means that you have to have leverage that. And I think the best way to leverage that is to have them work on teams. And so it's because the multimedia cost is so low that actually has increased the opportunity cost of lecturing in the classroom dramatically. And I think it's a natural process, and it's just destined to end, I think, in the principles.
I personally, I'm sorry.
Well, here's another way in which students have changed, which I think ties some of this together. All of us might not see this, but if you look at the educational market as a whole, students are much older than they used to be. The 18-year-old picture of the kid going to college, those are actually not the majority anymore. Some of my kids today, I was going to say kids, some of my students today have children of their own, right, which was not true in the past. And in the market as a whole, people coming back to school, people coming to raise their educational level, that has become much more common. This is another reason why online methods are favored, or online methods are growing, is because people with jobs, people with kids, people with jobs The only credible means of lifetime education is actually through kind of an online, at least partial, at least hybrid online market model. Right? If you're going to have lifetime learning, you're not going to have a 40-year-old come back and be full-time student. So, but yet 40-year-olds are coming back for schooling, and it's a much bigger portion of the market than it ever was before.
So let me ask you about wishes for technological improvements, textbooks or support. What would make your job easier in terms of being successful at having the students learn the economics?
Yeah.
Jose?
Yeah, for me it's motivation, and that's kind of the part that I'm a little bit disappointed with. The technology is going in great directions in multimedia. In terms of the bad thing I see is that being over-focusing on testing, and so it's it's like test, and I think if we are going to do a lot more active learning in class. Really, this is how it happened to me, right? So I do a lot more active learning in class, and I wanted to motivate students because I now have the time in class to do it by doing group work and stuff. And then I had a student who came afterwards and told me, oh, it's not going to be on the exam, right? That is more frustrating now than it was 20 years ago because I'm spending a lot more time trying not to get that question. So I think I would like technology to improve it's improving student motivation. To get them to really be curious, to maybe the competitional aspect, to leverage that, the playing aspect of learning. I wish the technology was a little better on that regard.
Given that first presentation today where we saw that the students couldn't identify what they didn't know, I think that it would be really nice if we had a technological change where you could actually, maybe without their name, show what their grades were going through or who missed this question, how many people missed this question.
Right. Or even collecting so students working on team and then reporting as a team. I mean, there's still not a good tool that actually allows you to do that in the classroom, right? So you have 4 students working together, and only one of them have to submit to the grade book. I mean, there's very few technologies that allow you to do that, right? Yeah. Technologies that allow you to scale the Socratic method. There hasn't been that many. I mean, maybe AI has some degree, but
it's great. Those 40-year-olds are great because they are taking charge of their own education, and they are there for one reason and one reason only, to learn. I'll probably get a text from my daughter talking about rational ignorance, or what the first speaker was talking about. She's kind of upset. She's a freshman in college. She's studying engineering physics, a major she picked while a high school junior, right? And now feels like it's really difficult to switch majors. She's given up on something. But if there's ever a time you don't know what you don't know, it's what are engineering classes at college when you're in high school? I digress. But the technology can be useful, but it's still got to be motivational and still have to get students actively involved in their learning. Back to my own children, I have one child that is motivated and wants to learn everything, and one that struggles with motivation, has it, but it's constantly there, uses the technology in the way that uses the technology, watches the videos, but I'm not sure how engaged just going through some videos are. Some are much, much better than others, and so it's a constant.
Yeah, we don't know because we don't know much about motivation in general. We haven't studied that very much. I mean, we're very good at teaching motivated students, but I think we're less better at motivating students that don't want to learn.
I think that's what grades have traditionally done.
That's what I'm saying, but there's so much. I mean, the research is so overwhelmingly in one direction that grades, external rewards, is a really competitive performance rewards is a very bad way of motivating students to learn. I mean, it's just not even debatable, I think. So. I mean, we just haven't adopted it yet, but I think we will as we shift from content providers to motivators, which I think is how we're shifting. I think we will begin to ask those questions, I think.
So do you think grades will become obsolete at some point?
And my hope is my daughter, she's 3, when she go to school, I hope that she's not have to do grade stuff. That's my hope. I think that would be a change in education. I mean, if we're still motivating with grades, I mean, what have we done? We haven't done anything, in my opinion. If she still comes to, is that going to be in the exam? If my daughter is asking that, I mean, seriously. What have we done, really? Yeah, no,
For
yeah,
the
right.
sake of knowledge.
She's actually, oh, I'm so interested to go back to that class, you know?
I think you can motivate a lot of students, or at least on certain topics. Maybe you can motivate all students, but not all the time.
That's why it's so pervasive, because I see a presentation that said, oh, if you wanted to do active learning, you have to reward it with grades, if not, they won't do it. It's pervasive.
But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for actually an economics reason, is that when you have these online technologies which scale, as I had mentioned, this means if you've got 100,000 students, well, now it makes sense to spend, $10 per student. It's $1 million figuring out what actually does work.
Yeah.
Right? So the incentives, not only do we have the technology, but because these technologies scale and you have more of a winner-take-all market, the incentives to actually learn what works have increased.
Yeah. And we know the gaming industry knows
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. The gaming industry is an excellent example. It's a very similar structure. And also, I do think that small things can make a big difference. So, in the first edition of the textbook and in my classes, I would have some questions involving go get some data, download some data, and use Excel and graph the data, right? Now, this is great if you have a small classroom. But when you've got a lot of students, very quickly, you know what happens. They say, well, I have Excel 2.0, it's different than you taught me, because you said use 3.0, and then I couldn't download the data, and it's different on a Mac than it is on a PC. And the professor ends up most of their time teaching how to use, computers or something like that. Now, however, and with the 4th edition of the book, and available now, you tell them to go to Fred, right? Just unbelievable. So Fred has taken, the St. Louis Federal Reserve Economic Database, has taken so much of the pain out of that process that you go to Fred, you very quickly find the data, it graphs it all for you. You don't have to make any choices about, margins or, axes or, colors or anything like that. It graphs it all for you. The data, is as up to date as data is, and it just takes so much of the pain out of the process. It works on PCs, it works on Macs, that it's now much easier to ask questions like this. So we're taking advantage of that in the book to take students with Ask Fred questions, take them out to Fred to real data. And the fact that you can do that today at much lower cost, I think, again, is changing how we teach and really how we should teach.
It strikes me that the gaming industry may have some insights.
Yeah.
Rather than angry birds, we could have angry economists. And I just got to get to that next level so that I feel self-pride or whatever it is.
Somehow the gaming industry can teach people to do this all day.
I know,
right?
I know. They don't give them grades or anything.
I'm teaching them incentives and supply and demand. That's much more interesting than doing this all day.
I know.
So we ought to be able to incentivize that.
Although one thing about I think that we can convey, maybe it's difficult to do on video, I don't know, I haven't done it, is a sense of excitement about what we actually do as teachers and why we were so impassioned and we started studying economics and went on to get our PhDs and so forth.
Absolutely.
I can do that in the classroom quite effectively, and I think that motivates one person a year or something, I don't know, some good number like that. But motivates enough that you do get some people becoming interested in the majors and then they move on and so forth. And certainly that was the case for me, and I went on to write a textbook. So it's there. It's just hard to get at that motivational factor. And I think we also have to be realistic as economists that economics may not be the motivational, the right field for everyone. So then the question then becomes, what type of motivation do we get? What do we want the non-economic majors or not even business majors to sort of get out of the class? And we have some discussions on those lines as well that you could fill a session on.
So is that when you need grades for the non-majors?
Well,
Say
Jose
no,
says
say
no,
no, please. Say no.
I don't.
It is very. I mean, it is very
I don't
easy
know
to
a
give
better
him
way.
sticks. It's very easy to give sticks and carrots. I mean, that's just. I think we do it because of that, not because we think it's actually really effective.
Right, and I think that's what the MIT does, and Brown does it harder classes, grades are optionals and so forth. But those are like the super 1% of students, and I'm not sure that the students at Central State, not to pick any school, are there yet, where they're just going to go there at 19 and say, you know what, I'm just here because I want to learn.
Right.
And
well, again, I mean, I give them the more benefit of the doubt. And I think we're not going to have a choice. I think the grade inflation issue, for instance, that means that grades are going to mean less and less to finding a job. And then when that becomes true, I mean, then we can't really use them anymore. So we have to figure some other way.
But we can make changes like this on the margin. Like, people are often asking me, well, how do I assess this particular concept? And sometimes it's a tricky concept, seeing the invisible hand or something like that. And I say, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter, because you're going to do assessment on something, calculating an elasticity or something like that. And these things correlate, okay? They correlate really closely. So as long as you're assessing on something, don't obsess about assessment, is my view. You assess on something, the rest will take care of itself. So don't, just because you can't assess something, if it's important, still teach it. You can do that. People have freedom to do that. Not everybody knows that, but it's true.
Thanks.
Thank you.